see so many John Jay students here. I make you feel at home. And I certainly do want to thank the Center for Ethics Education at Fordham, the sponsors, co-sponsors of this event, and King's College, and especially Professor Bradley was good enough to invite me and encourage me to participate. I didn't need much encouragement, actually. I thought this was wonderful. I'm going to take the Fifth Amendment on the question before us, and you'll think it's a bit of a cop-out. But what I'm going to do, instead of answering, are we over-punishing violent offenders, I'm going to provide you with some empirical data so that you can answer the question for yourself. And maybe when we do the Q&A, you can try to pin me down a little bit more. So I'm going to address 3 points. 1, what punishments are currently imposed on violent offenders? 2, what punishments have been imposed on violent offenders in the past, so that we can compare the past to the present? And 3, what punishments are imposed on violent offenders in countries comparable to ours, so we could see how the U.S. is doing it compared to some other countries. So let's go right to question 1, what punishments are currently imposed on violent offenders? First, we have to define violent offenders. When criminologists think of violent offenders, they rely on the FBI's uniform crime reports, which define violent crimes as including murder, manslaughter, which is a lesser criminal homicide than murder, rape, or as it's sometimes called in a number of states, sexual assault, robbery, and assault. So those are the crimes that we criminologists consider violent crimes, and those are the ones that I will be designating as the violent crimes under discussion for the purposes of my talk. Now, not all convicted violent criminals are incarcerated, so we have to begin with those who are incarcerated and those who are not. 1 out of 5, as a matter of fact, 20% get a non-incarcerative sentence of probation. That means their sentence permits them to go into the community. 1 in 4, 24%, are sentenced to jail. Now, jail, as opposed to prison, involves shorter time spans, shorter sentences, shorter time served. And the average time served in jail for violent offenders is 6 months. 54% of convicted offenders are sent to prison. And I want to focus mainly on this 54% because usually they do the most serious violent offenses. Now, of this group, only 1 out of 5, around 20%, serve their full sentences. 80% are released to the community prior to serving full sentences. So when we ask the question, how much punishment is imposed on these prisoners, we have to look past the sentences to what we call the time served. The time served is how much time they spent in prison when they were released prior to the completion of their full sentence. So I'm going to give you the numbers. These are not on the handout, but a little later in the talk I'm going to refer to the handouts. You might want to find that. That was on the back of your seat, I believe. But these numbers are not on the handout. So for each crime that the Uniform Crime Reports considers a violent crime, a serious violent crime, we have a median time served. The median is the punishment. If you line up all the punishments from the harshest to the least harsh, the one in the middle would be the median. And we use that instead of the mean or average because the mean is very influenced by extreme punishments, extreme sentences at the high end, the outliers as we call them. And the median is a little more impervious to that kind of influence. So we use the median sentence. So for murder or manslaughter, the median time served in the United States, that means murder and manslaughter combined, is 8 years and 11 months. So in other words, 50% of the prisoners will get a little less time than that, 50% of them will get a little more time than that. And that's the harshest sentence we impose, except for murder alone. For murder alone, the median sentence is 9 years and 3 months. Now, what period of time am I talking about? These data are from 1995 to 2012. And that's as recent as we get. Beyond 2012, we really don't have data, because by the time the prisoner is released, and then they poll to see how much time they served, and then they gather all the data together and do the calculations and publish it, you have this lag in time. So 9 years and 3 months is the median time served for murderers. What about for assault? 1 year, 8 months. That's the median time served for assault. For rape, 5 years, 3 months. And for robbery, 3 years, 1 month. So later on, if you didn't get all that and you want it, I'll repeat it. Now, although drug offenses are associated with violent crime, they're not really considered a violent crime per se. But just for your information, if you look at the median time served for drug offenders in state prisons, it's 1 year and 3 months. Okay, this brings us to question 2. And here's where you'll find the handout help. What punishments have been imposed on violent offenders in the past in the United States? So if you look at the top, this is the gold-colored one in your handout, top table, I divide the historical era for which we have usable data, because there's really not very good usable data before the 1920s. I divide this into 3 periods, roughly based on the amount of violent crime committed in each period. So in period 1, this covers 1923 to 1964. Most of this period, from 1934 at least until 1964, had relatively low crime rates. So I'm going to treat this as the low crime era. Period 2, 1970 to 1993, was a period of very high crime. I call it the crime tsunami era because it was more than a wave, it was a crime tsunami. During this period, more Americans were murdered than were killed in all our wars put together from World War II on. That's over 1.5 million. Period 3, the period we're living through now, I have data from 1994 to 2012, and this period had relatively low crime rates, comparable to the early 1960s. So my thinking here was that if the period had high crime rates, you'd expect higher time served, right? You'd expect longer or greater punishments, and if it had low crime rates, you'd expect lesser punishments. But it didn't always work out that way, so we have some anomalies here. So if you look at the figures in period 2, the crime tsunami era, what we see is that the punishments, the time served, increased for murder, manslaughter combined, compared with 1923 to 1964. And it increased for, pardon me, and for rape. And you can see that figure. But the time served actually declined for murder alone, and for assault, and for robbery. So in the years with our worst crime, prisoners were serving less time than they had been serving in the prior era, which was a lower crime era. Now, what about the more recent period, 1994 to 2012? Here we see some additional anomalies, and criminologists are still trying to explain why this is so. Here we have a period of relatively low crime, and despite that, we have some punishments increasing rather substantially. For instance, for criminal homicides and for rape, the punishments are, as you could see from the table, much higher than they had been during the crime tsunami era, the era in the middle, the column in the middle. And this is despite the fact that the crime rates are lower. Now, if you look at the graph, the black box just below that table, you could see on a yearly basis how the punishments developed or were imposed for each crime. So the 2 lines at the top are for murder and for murder and manslaughter combined. And what we see is a marked increase, and ironically, an increase in the 21st century by and large, which, as I said, is a period of lower crime. On the other hand, for rape, we see a less significant increase. It's been mostly level, and then an increase after around the year 2000, then it leveled off again. So the punishments for rape have increased in the 21st century, but not as much as for murder and manslaughter combined. What about for robbery and assault? Now, of course, many more offenders commit robbery and assault than commit murder and rape. So this really affects or reflects the punishments for more people, more defendants. Well, you can see that while there was a little bit of a rise in around 2000, for the most part, these lines are flat. So we don't see a big increase in punishments for robbers and people who do assaults. Now, the question I'm not going to address, but one that is of great interest to criminologists, is how do we explain why punishments have increased for murder, manslaughter combined, and for rape in a time when crime has been declining? So that's just a question to think about, and it's not one that I'm going to address here this evening. And that brings us to question 3. What punishments are imposed on violent offenders in countries comparable to ours? Now here I relied on a study done by Al Blumstein, Michael Tonry, and Van Ness. I don't remember her first name. They studied the average time served in the United States and 7 other countries. England and Wales, that's considered one country, Sweden, Australia, Scotland, Canada, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. They covered the period 1980 to 1999. So if you look at the handout on the flip side, you'll see the results of their work on this top graph. So the United States is the green bar all the way on the left, and you can see that we are pretty high up in imposing punishment compared with these other countries. The United States, according to this study, was more punitive than the average of the 7 other countries for each violent crime, and the U.S. was the most punitive nation of the 8 for rape and robbery, imposing for each of those crimes twice as long a time behind bars. So you can see this in the 2 other accompanying graphics, the table in the middle and the table at the bottom. The table in the middle, in bold, we see which country imposed the highest punishments for each crime, and you can see the U.S. imposed the most for rape and for robbery, Canada imposed the most for assault, and Australia the most for homicide. And you can see that by the bold-faced figures. Now, if you compare the average time served in the United States for each crime and the average time served not including the United States, this is the bottom table, you will see that we exceed all these other countries averaged together in each offense. So for homicide, our murderers spend 31 more months in prison than the European ones do. For rape, 30.2 months, for robbery, 20 months, and for assault, 11.6 months. And these are averages. So this would suggest then that we give higher punishments than these other countries, the European countries, and also Australia and Canada. But I have a couple of qualifiers for this study. The most obvious one is that their data set ends with 1999. So they didn't discuss the 21st century. And as we know from the flip side, We know that crime punishments leveled off in the 21st century. We know that because we see this on the black graph on the other side of the sheet. So they did not cover anything past 1999. I would expect that there would be not complete uniformity between us and the Europeans, but I would expect we would narrow the gap a bit since our punishments declined in the 21st century. The second limitation is the study of these other countries did not take account of recidivism. Recidivism means, of course, repeat offenders. Now, the reason this is a shortcoming is this. If you are going to be sentenced for a crime and you've repeatedly committed crimes, you are a recidivist, you're going to receive a higher sentence. So because the United States had this crime tsunami, we have a lot of defendants, many more than the Europeans have, and when they come up for sentencing, should they repeat their offenses, they will get higher sentences. So the study by Blumstein et al. Did not take recidivism into account, maybe because they couldn't get the data. The Europeans are not very good at covering things like recidivism. It's very difficult to get data on this sort of thing. The other thing they didn't take into account, the final significant difference between us and the other countries studied here in the Blumstein study, is the issue of gun crimes. As you know, we have lots of gun crimes in the United States, way many more gun crimes than they have in Europe or even in Canada and even in Australia. So gun crimes also result in higher sentences. And we don't know how many of the sentences imposed in Europe were due to gun crimes. So our sentences are undoubtedly higher than because of recidivism and because of gun crimes. How much more time do I have, please? I'm out of time? Why'd I ask?